My daughter-in-law slapped me 13 times across the face at a crowded dinner table, while my own son stared at his plate in dead silence. I swallowed the burning humiliation, bit my tongue, and waited patiently until the dessert plates were cleared. Then I stood up, reached into my worn leather jacket, and permanently canceled her $15 million inheritance. The smug, arrogant smile vanished from her face in a fraction of a second. My name is Silas Hawthorne. I am 68 years old, and for 35 years I worked as a senior maritime salvage master, pulling broken ships out of dark waters and rebuilding commercial docks across the eastern seaboard. I spent my life surviving shifting tides, crushing ocean pressures, and freezing gales, but absolutely nothing prepared me for the icy cruelty waiting for me in a dining room in a wealthy Boston suburb. It was a Tuesday evening, and the house was a sprawling, pristine estate with manicured lawns and towering white pillars. Chloe, my son, Lucas's wife, loved to parade that house to her high society friends. She loved to host these lavish dinner parties where the wine cost more than my first salvage boat. What none of those guests knew, and what Chloe conveniently forgot every time she poured a glass of imported champagne, was that I bought that house for them. I paid for the marble countertops, the crystal chandeliers, and the vaulted ceilings in cash, so my son would never have to know the crushing weight of a mortgage. I practiced silent wealth. I lived in a modest coastal cottage, drove an old truck, and kept my fortune hidden, wanting my family to have the security I never had growing up. I was wearing my best suit that night. It was out of style, a little tight around the shoulders from decades of hauling heavy chains and steel cables, but it was clean and pressed. I sat at the far end of the long mahogany dining table, surrounded by Chloe's wealthy friends and her sister Brenda. Brenda was just like Chloe, dripping in expensive jewelry and unearned condescension. They were discussing a recent charity gala, throwing around names of politicians and corporate executives, laughing loudly at inside jokes. I kept quiet, focusing on my meal, trying not to be a nuisance. I just wanted to spend a quiet evening with my son. But my hands are old. They are scarred and calloused, battered by decades of freezing salt water and heavy machinery. As I reached for my water glass, my thick knuckles clipped the edge of a tall, delicate crystal wine glass. It tipped over in slow motion. The dark red wine spilled across the pristine white tablecloths, soaking into the expensive fabric and pooling near a massive silver centerpiece. The entire room went dead silent. The lively chatter vanished instantly. Chloe stopped mid-sentence. She slowly turned her head toward me. Her eyes, usually masked with a fake, practiced sweetness, turned into chips of pure ice. I quickly grabbed my cloth napkin and started dabbing at the dark red stain, apologizing profusely to the table. I told her I was sorry that my hands were just a little stiff from the cold weather outside, and that I would pay to have the linens professionally cleaned. I expected a heavy sigh, maybe an annoyed roll of the eyes, or a sharp comment about my clumsiness. I did not expect what came next. Chloe stood up from her heavily upholstered chair. She smoothed her designer silk dress, walked slowly around the long table, and stopped right next to me. She smiled, but it was a terrifying, hollow smile that did not reach her eyes. She looked at her wealthy guests and let out a light, airy laugh. She told them not to worry, that dear old Silas was just suffering from senile clumsiness again. She announced to the silent room that they had a special family game they played to help me remember my manners and keep my aging brain sharp. She called it the 13 Taps. I looked up at her, completely confused by her words. Before I could even register the threat, her hand swung down. A sharp, stinging slap landed directly across my left cheek. The crack echoed off the vaulted ceiling like a gunshot. The guests gasped, shifting in their seats, but nobody moved. I froze, completely paralyzed by the sheer audacity of the strike. My cheek burned with sudden, fierce heat. I looked over at Lucas. My boy. The son I had broken my back to put through college, the boy I had shielded from every hardship in the world. He was sitting just 3 feet away. He did not look up. He stared down at his expensive plate of roasted duck, his shoulders hunched, completely silent. He was letting his wife strike his father. Chloe did not stop. She raised her hand again. She struck the back of my calloused hands resting on the table. She said that was number 2 for tracking mud onto the foyer rug last week. She slapped my right cheek. Number 3, she announced loudly, for embarrassing her in front of the neighborhood association by parking my rusted truck in their pristine driveway. Number 4 landed hard on my jaw. Number 5 stung my ear. She kept counting, her voice dripping with venomous theatrical glee. Brenda, her sister, actually let out a short, amused giggle from across the table, covering her mouth with a manicured hand as if she were watching a comedy routine. The other guests shifted uncomfortably, staring down at their laps, refusing to meet my eyes, but absolutely nobody intervened. They were too afraid of Chloe's social wrath, or maybe they truly believed I was just a senile, dependent old fool who needed to be physically put in his place. Each slap was a physical blow, but the true agony was the psychological torment tearing through my chest. Number 6. Number 7. Number 8. She struck my face, my shoulders, my hands. I am a man who has faced down hurricane swells and survived dockside accidents that would break an ordinary man. I could have easily stood up, grabbed her by the wrist, and thrown her out of the very house I legally owned and paid for. My muscles coiled instinctively, my adrenaline surging, ready to defend myself from the assault. But the profound betrayal anchoring me to my chair was heavier than any ship's anchor. If I reacted with the violence my body wanted to unleash, I would be the crazy, dangerous old man she claimed I was. She would use it against me. She would call the police, play the victim, and ruin the quiet life I had built to honor my late wife. So I forced my body to go limp. I took every single strike. I felt the heat rising in my face, the stinging welts forming on my cheekbones, the deep, agonizing heartbreak shattering my soul as I realized my son was a coward. Number 11. Number 12. And finally a forceful, ringing slap across my mouth. Number 13, she whispered, leaning close so I could smell her expensive, suffocating perfume. She said that final tap was for simply existing in her house and breathing her air tonight, and that I needed to learn my place. Chloe walked back to her seat, casually smoothing her hair, and asked the hired maid to pour more wine, as if she had simply swatted an annoying fly away from her meal. The guests, eager to move past the horrific awkwardness, nervously resumed their shallow chatter, pretending nothing had happened. Brenda smirked at me, raising her crystal glass in a mocking, silent toast. I did not move. I did not speak. I sat there with my large hands resting heavily on my lap, feeling the pulsating heat of the 13 slaps burning on my skin. I looked at Lucas again. He finally raised his eyes, caught my gaze for a fraction of a second, and then quickly looked away, taking a large, desperate gulp of his red wine. The cowardice in his eyes was the final nail in the coffin. The son I loved, the boy I had sacrificed my youth and my body for, was completely gone, replaced by a weak, complicit shell controlled by a cruel monster. I sat in absolute, terrifying silence for 45 minutes. I watched the staff clear the dinner plates. I listened to the clinking of silverware and the hollow laughter of people who had just watched an elder be abused. I let the humiliation burn into my soul, forging a new, unbreakable resolve deep within my chest. I realized then that my unconditional trust had been a fatal, catastrophic error. I had given them wealth, comfort, and security without making them earn the basic respect that comes with it. They thought I was just a rusty, disposable wallet. They thought they had all the power in this dynamic. They were completely wrong. When the dessert spoons began clinking against the porcelain bowls of crème brûlée, I knew it was time. I slowly pushed my chair back. The heavy wooden legs scraped loudly against the hardwood floor, cutting through the murmurs of the guests like a siren. Everyone turned to look at me, their conversations dying in their throats. Chloe raised an eyebrow, wearing a look of annoyed superiority, her arms crossed defensively. She asked in a mocking tone if I needed help finding the bathroom, treating me like a lost toddler. I did not answer her. I reached into the inner pocket of my weathered leather jacket, the one I had worn on the salvage docks for 20 years. My fingers wrapped around a thick, folded legal document. I pulled it out and placed it flat on the pristine white tablecloth right next to the spreading wine stain. I pulled a silver pen from my shirt pocket and uncapped it slowly, deliberately, letting the silence in the room stretch until it became suffocating. The room fell entirely silent again this time, not from shock over a spilled glass, but from sudden, palpable tension. Lucas finally spoke up, his voice cracking slightly with nervous fear. He asked me what I was doing, glancing between the paper and my bruised face. I did not look at him. I looked directly at Chloe, locking my cold eyes with hers. I spoke in a low, resonant voice, steady and unyielding, carrying the weight of a man who commanded commercial fleets. I announced to the table that I was holding the signature page of my generation, Skipping Corporate Trust. I explained clearly so every single wealthy guest could hear that this document controlled the final $15 million tranche of my maritime estate, a massive sum that was legally scheduled to transfer entirely to Lucas and Chloe on my 70th birthday. Chloe's face went completely pale. The blood drained from her cheeks in an instant. The arrogant, untouchable smirk vanished, replaced by sudden, wide-eyed, breathless panic. She opened her mouth to speak, to backtrack, to suddenly play the sweet, misunderstood daughter-in-law, but I did not let her utter a single syllable. I pressed the tip of the pen to the thick paper. I told her that 13 slaps was an incredibly expensive game to play. I told her that human dignity is not something you can just slap out of a man who built his entire life and empire from freezing saltwater sweat and steel. Without breaking eye contact with her terrified face, I signed my name across the revocation line with sharp, aggressive strokes. I executed my absolute legal right to permanently cancel the inheritance. I folded the document, slowly smoothing the crease, and tucked it safely back into my jacket pocket. Chloe shot up from her chair, knocking it backward onto the floor, sputtering, gasping for breath, her hands trembling wildly as the reality of losing $15 million crushed her. Lucas looked like he was about to vomit, gripping the edge of the table. Brenda dropped her dessert spoon, the clatter echoing loudly in the stunned, frozen room. I did not yell. I did not curse them or throw a fit. I simply turned my back on the entire room of wealthy parasites, walked down the grand, echoing hallway, and pushed open the heavy mahogany front doors. I stepped out into the freezing, driving rain of the Boston night. The cold water washed over the burning, swollen welts on my face, and as I walked down the driveway toward my old truck, I felt more powerful, more awake, and more dangerous than I had felt in decades. The freezing rain of the Massachusetts night hit my face the second I pushed through those massive mahogany doors. I did not flinch. I let the icy downpour wash over me as I walked down the long, sweeping driveway that I had paid for with my own sweat and blood. The freezing water ran down my collar, soaking into the fabric of my outdated suit, but it was nothing compared to the absolute cold radiating from my own chest. Behind me, the towering white pillars of the estate glowed under the warm, manicured landscape lighting. Inside that house sat a group of people who had just watched a woman physically strike an elderly man 13 times without raising a single finger to stop it. And worst of all, One of those people was my own flesh and blood. I reached the end of the driveway where the valet had parked my old faded blue Ford truck. It stuck out like a rusted sore thumb among the sleek European sports cars and luxury SUVs belonging to Chloe's high society friends. I climbed into the cab, the worn leather of the bench seat creaking under my weight. I turned the key, and the heavy diesel engine roared to life, vibrating through the floorboards. I sat there for a moment in the dark, gripping the cracked steering wheel. The physical sting of the slaps across my cheeks and the backs of my hands was already beginning to fade, numbed by the bitter cold of the truck cabin. But the deeper invisible wound, the profound betrayal of my son's silence, burned like a chemical fire in my gut. I put the truck in gear and pulled out onto the slick, winding suburban roads. The rhythmic swish of the windshield wipers was the only sound keeping me company as I navigated through the affluent neighborhoods heading east toward the rocky coastline. With every mile that passed, the suffocating atmosphere of Chloe's dinner party receded, replaced by the heavy, oppressive silence of my own thoughts. I kept seeing Lucas staring down at his roasted duck. I kept seeing his shoulders hunched, his eyes fixed on his plate, while his wife humiliated the man who had given him everything. As the tires hissed over the wet asphalt of the coastal highway, the smell of the ocean began to seep through the vents of the truck. The sharp, briny scent of salt and seaweed washed away the lingering ghost of Chloe's expensive perfume. The ocean has always been my sanctuary, my battleground, and my greatest teacher. It was the place where I had built my life, and it was the place where my mind always returned when the ground beneath me felt unstable. I thought about my late wife, Helen. God, how I missed her. Helen was the compass that had kept my life pointing true north for over 40 years. When we first met, I was nothing but a reckless, stubborn young man with salt water in my lungs and a rusted, beat-up trawler to my name. We had nothing but a shared vision and a desperate hunger to carve out a place in the world. I spent decades on the brutal, unforgiving waters of the North Atlantic. I hauled heavy freezing chains with my bare hands. I stood on the decks of groaning ships, while 30-foot swells threatened to swallow us whole. I worked 20-hour shifts in the freezing rain, smelling constantly of diesel fuel, fish guts, and engine grease. I sacrificed my youth and my body to the sea. My knuckles are permanently swollen from arthritis. My lower back screams in agony every time the weather changes. I carry scars on my arms and chest from snapped steel cables and jagged rust. But I endured every single moment of that physical torment for one simple reason. I wanted my son to have a life I could only dream of. I wanted Lucas to grow up with soft hands. I wanted him to hold expensive fountain pens in climate-controlled offices, not gaff hooks on freezing decks. I wanted him to wear tailored suits, not heavy rubber overalls soaked in fish blood. Helen and I built a maritime salvage and commercial fishing empire from nothing. While I was out on the water wrestling with broken ships and violent storms, Helen was the brilliant mind managing the books, negotiating the dock fees, and expanding our fleet. We became quietly deeply wealthy. We practiced silent wealth because we never felt the need to prove our worth to strangers. We lived in a modest, weather-beaten cottage right on the cliffs overlooking the harbor. We drove old trucks and lived simply because our security was not tied to flashy mansions or crystal wine glasses. But in our desperate desire to give Lucas a perfect, painless life, we made a catastrophic mistake. We gave him the rewards of our labor without ever teaching him the brutal cost of $1. We shielded him from every storm, every hardship, and every disappointment. We built a massive fortress around him to keep him safe from the harsh realities of the world. And in doing so, we raised a boy who never developed a spine. We raised a man who did not know how to stand his ground when the winds began to howl. When Helen passed away 2 years ago from a sudden aggressive illness, my world completely collapsed. The anchor of my life was suddenly cut loose, leaving me adrift in an ocean of grief. In my devastating sorrow, I leaned heavily on Lucas. I transferred the deed of that massive suburban estate to him, a house I had purchased outright in cash. I gave him sweeping power of attorney over certain accounts, believing that an old man with a broken heart needed his son to take the helm. I trusted him unconditionally. He was my blood, my legacy, the final piece of Helen I had left in this world. But as I drove down the dark, winding coastal road, the brutal truth finally crystallized in my mind. My unconditional trust had not empowered my son. It had simply created a vacuum, and a monster had gladly stepped in to fill it. Chloe recognized a weak vessel the moment she met Lucas. She saw a man accustomed to comfort but incapable of confrontation. She saw a fortune built by a rough, uneducated fisherman and decided she was infinitely more deserving of it. She exploited his softness, manipulated his insecurities, and slowly, methodically isolated him from the only man who truly had his best interests at heart. The rain battered the windshield of my truck, mirroring the storm raging inside my head. The humiliation I had felt at the dinner table was completely gone. The shame was gone. The sorrow of a grieving father was rapidly burning away, replaced by the cold, calculating mind of a salvage master facing a sinking ship. I realized I could not afford to mourn my son's betrayal right now. Mourning was a luxury for peacetime, and I was suddenly thrust into the middle of a war. I finally pulled onto the gravel driveway of my small coastal cottage. The headlights swept across the weathered wooden siding and the wild, overgrown dune grass. I turned off the engine and sat in the quiet cab for a long moment, listening to the roar of the Atlantic waves crashing against the rocks below my property. I stepped out of the truck, the freezing wind whipping at my wet clothes, and walked up the creaking wooden steps to my front porch. I unlocked the heavy deadbolt and stepped into the dark, silent house. The smell of old wood, sea salt, and memories of Helen greeted me. I turned on a single lamp in the small living room and walked straight into the bathroom. I leaned over the porcelain sink and stared at my reflection in the mirror. My face was flushed. The red, swollen imprints of Chloe's fingers were clearly visible across my cheek and jawline. 13 slaps. 13 sharp, arrogant strikes meant to break my spirit and establish her absolute dominance. I splashed freezing cold water on my face, letting it run down my neck and soak into my ruined suit collar. I stared into my own eyes hard and unblinking. I had spent my entire life pulling massive shattered structures out of the deadly depths of the ocean. I knew how to identify structural weaknesses. I knew how to calculate pressure. I knew exactly how to dismantle a rotting vessel without getting pulled down into the abyss with it. Chloe thought she was dealing with a senile, dependent old fool who would simply roll over and accept her abuse to maintain the illusion of a happy family. She thought my silence at the dinner table was a sign of submission. She had absolutely no idea that my silence was the sound of a trap being set. By trying to humiliate me, she had completely underestimated the man she was dealing with. I dried my face with a rough towel and walked back into the living room. I moved to the old oak roll-top desk in the corner, a desk where Helen used to spend hours managing the early finances of our fledgling company. I ran my calloused fingers over the smooth wood. I was not going to let a cruel, socially climbing parasite destroy the legacy that Helen and I had built with our bare hands. I was not going to let Chloe dismantle the financial security of our shipping fleet to fund her pathetic, shallow lifestyle. I walked to the front door and threw the heavy iron deadbolt, locking out the world. I pulled the curtains tight. I walked into the small kitchen, filled the old percolator with water, and started a fresh pot of black coffee. It was going to be a very long night. The emotional paralysis was over. The shock had completely dissipated. I was no longer an abused, discarded father hoping for scraps of affection from a cowardly son. I was Silas Hawthorne, the founder and master of the Hawthorne Maritime Fleet, and I was going to war. I knew Chloe would not accept the loss of a $15 million inheritance quietly. She was arrogant, greedy, and prone to vicious retaliation. She would undoubtedly launch an immediate and aggressive counterattack to try and force my hand. She would try to paint me as unstable. She would use Lucas as a pawn to manipulate my emotions. But I was already 10 steps ahead of her. I sat down at the kitchen table, the hot mug of coffee warming my battered hands. I reached into my jacket pocket and pulled out the signed revocation document, the piece of paper that had wiped the smug smile off her face just an hour ago. I smoothed it out on the table. This was only the first shot fired in a conflict that was about to escalate beyond anything Chloe could possibly imagine. She wanted to play a psychological game of dominance and humiliation. I was going to play a game of absolute systematic financial destruction. I took a notepad and a pen and began to outline my strategy. Every asset, every bank account, every piece of real estate, and every corporate loophole. I was going to build an impenetrable legal and financial fortress. I would gather every shred of evidence, every whisper of their cruelty, and every record of their greed. I would not yell, I would not threaten, and I would not lift a finger in violence. I would simply lay out a perfect, flawless trap, and I would watch with absolute satisfaction as Chloe and Lucas locked themselves inside it. The morning sun broke through the heavy gray clouds just as my third pot of black coffee finished brewing. I stood by the kitchen window of my coastal cottage, watching the angry ocean violently crash against the jagged rocks below. The physical sting on my face from the night before had faded into a dull, throbbing ache, but my mind was operating with a terrifying, icy clarity. I knew Chloe. I knew the exact breed of venomous arrogance she possessed. A woman who felt entitled to a $15 million inheritance simply for marrying my son was not going to quietly accept defeat. I had publicly humiliated her. I had stripped away her golden ticket right in front of her high society audience. A cornered predator does not simply walk away from a fight. She would retaliate. She would want blood, and I needed to know exactly what kind of weapon she was planning to swing at my head. I walked over to the sturdy oak desk in the corner of my living room and opened my heavy laptop. When I purchased that sprawling suburban estate for Lucas and Chloe 5 years ago, I did not just hand over the keys and walk away. I wanted them to be safe. I wanted to protect my investment. I personally hired a top-tier security firm to wire the entire property. They installed high-definition cameras at every entrance, motion sensors on the windows, and a sophisticated internal audio and video monitoring system in the main living spaces. It was a comprehensive smart home network. Because I legally owned the property and paid the hefty monthly monitoring premiums out of my own pocket, I held the master administrative rights. Chloe and Lucas knew the cameras were there, of course. But over the years, they had grown so incredibly comfortable in their unearned luxury that they completely forgot who actually controlled the digital keys to their castle. I logged into the security portal. The screen illuminated my weathered face as a grid of live camera feeds populated the dashboard. I could see the pristine kitchen, the grand foyer, and the formal dining room where the horror show had taken place just hours ago. The house was entirely still. I clicked on the archive tab, pulling up the stored data from the previous 24 hours. My initial thought was to review the footage from immediately after I walked out the front door. I wanted to hear the panic in their voices. I wanted to know what their immediate reaction was after losing the final trust tranche, but my hand paused over the trackpad. Decades on the brutal salvage docks had taught me to trust my deepest instincts. When a massive steel chain snaps under pressure, You do not just examine the broken link. You look at the tension that was building hours before the failure. Something about the dinner party had felt entirely too orchestrated. The way Chloe had seamlessly transitioned from a gracious host to a cruel abuser. The way the guests had remained so perfectly silent. The way my son had stared down at his plate, long before her hand ever made contact with my face. It was not a spontaneous outburst of anger. It was a performance. I adjusted the timeline slider backward. I scrolled past the evening hours, past the arrival of the catering staff, and settled on 10 o'clock in the morning, the day of the dinner party. I selected the camera positioned in their expansive marble kitchen. I put on my reading glasses, leaned close to the screen, and pressed play. The video feed showed the bright morning sunlight pouring through the large bay windows. Chloe was standing by the espresso machine, wearing a silk robe, casually stirring a ceramic cup. Lucas was sitting at the massive kitchen island, staring blankly at a tablet. For a few minutes, the audio captured nothing but the mundane sounds of a wealthy domestic morning. The hum of the refrigerator, the clinking of a silver spoon against porcelain. I was almost ready to skip forward when Chloe set her coffee cup down and turned to face my son. Her voice came through the laptop speakers crisp and deadly clear. She told Lucas that they needed to review the timeline for the evening one last time. She said she did not want any mistakes because they were incredibly close to the finish line. I leaned closer to the screen, my heart suddenly pounding a heavy, slow rhythm against my ribs. Lucas rubbed his face, looking exhausted. He told her he was nervous. He said I was not a predictable man. He warned her that pushing me too far could backfire violently. He reminded her that I had spent my entire life wrestling with broken ships and aggressive dock workers, and that I was not someone who took disrespect lightly. Chloe laughed. It was not a warm sound. It was a sharp, metallic sound that sent a literal chill down my spine. She walked over to Lucas, wrapped her arms around his shoulders, and whispered into his ear. She told him that my aggressive nature was exactly what they were counting on. She said the entire point of the evening was to break my legendary restraint. She outlined the game she had invented, the 13 taps. She explained that she was going to provoke me physically and verbally in front of a dozen credible, wealthy witnesses. She would humiliate me. She would strike my face. She would treat me like a disobedient dog. I sat frozen in my desk chair, the cold coastal air seeping through the window panes completely forgotten. I was listening to my own daughter-in-law meticulously plan my physical and psychological assault, while my son sat there and simply nodded his head. But the horror did not stop there. The true depth of their malice was still waiting in the dark. Chloe continued speaking, her voice dropping into a conspiratorial whisper. She told Lucas that when she slapped me for the final time, I would inevitably snap. She confidently predicted that I would explode with rage. She expected me to shout, to throw a punch, to overturn the heavy mahogany table. She wanted me to look completely out of control and dangerous. She said that the moment I reacted with violence, she would immediately dial the local police captain, a man she regularly played tennis with at the country club. I felt all the breath leave my lungs. My hands gripped the edges of my desk so tightly the wood groaned. Chloe laid out the ultimate goal. She said they would tell the police and the paramedics that the stress of losing my wife had finally rotted my brain. They would claim I was suffering from severe advanced dementia and that I had become a violent threat to myself and my family. They would demand that the officers place me under an involuntary psychiatric hold, a 5150. She told Lucas that once I was forcibly removed from the house, strapped to a gurney, and locked inside a sterile psychiatric ward, they would execute their final maneuver. My mind raced, processing the sheer legal devastation of what she was describing. If a prominent businessman is involuntarily committed for violent, erratic behavior, it triggers a catastrophic chain reaction in the courts. The power of attorney he had foolishly entrusted to Lucas would instantly transform into a weapon of mass destruction. He would be granted emergency medical and financial conservatorship over my entire life. Chloe spelled it out for him, pointing a manicured finger at his chest. She said they would not just have to wait for my 70th birthday to collect the final $15 million trust. With a medical conservatorship in place, Lucas would gain absolute immediate control over the entire Hawthorne maritime fleet. Every single commercial fishing boat, every salvage contract, every piece of waterfront real estate. The entire $40 million enterprise that Helen and I had built from nothing would be legally handed over to a weak coward and his greedy, manipulative wife. They were planning to liquidate my entire existence. They were going to sell off the fleet strand my loyal employees and vanish with the wealth while I was left heavily sedated in a locked white room, unable to legally advocate for my own freedom. The audio recording continued to play, but the sound faded into a dull ringing in my ears. I watched the video feed as Lucas stared at his tablet, his face pale. I waited desperately, hoping against all odds that my son would stand up. I prayed he would slam his fist on the island, tell her she was insane, and refuse to participate in the destruction of his own father. I waited for the boy I had raised to show a single ounce of moral courage. Instead, Lucas slowly nodded his head. He took a sip of his coffee and told Chloe that she needed to make sure her sister Brenda was ready to back up their story when the police arrived. He agreed to sit in absolute silence during the dinner party so that I would feel completely isolated and cornered. He agreed to sell me out for a life of easy luxury. I reached out and slammed my laptop shut. The sudden silence in the cottage was deafening. I sat in the dark living room staring at the blank wall. My chest heaved as my lungs fought for oxygen. The physical pain of the 13 slaps was absolutely nothing compared to the agonizing, crushing realization of what I had just witnessed. They were not just impatient, greedy children waiting for an old man to pass away. They were active predators. They had constructed a psychological guillotine designed to sever my freedom, my sanity, and my legacy in one swift drop. If I had allowed my natural anger to take over at that dinner table, if I had raised my voice or lifted my hand to defend myself, I would have stepped directly into their trap. I would have handed them the exact ammunition they needed to lock me away. My decision to swallow my pride, to sit there and endure the burning humiliation of her strikes, had unknowingly saved my life. My legendary restraint had been the only thing standing between my freedom and a locked psychiatric ward. A profound, terrifying calmness washed over my entire body. The grief and the sorrow of losing my son finally burned away, completely incinerated by the bright, hot reality of the situation. Lucas was no longer the boy I had taught to fish off the docks. He was an accomplice to my attempted ruin. He had made his choice. He chose the comfort of a wealthy lifestyle over the life and liberty of the father who had provided it all. I stood up from my desk. My joints popped and my muscles ached, but I stood taller than I had in years. I walked into the kitchen and poured the remaining black coffee into the sink. I did not need caffeine anymore. My veins were flooded with pure, unadulterated adrenaline. I now possessed the audio and video evidence of a conspiracy to commit elder abuse, medical fraud, and corporate theft. I held the absolute proof of their malicious intent. They thought they were playing a game of social manipulation and greedy shortcuts. They failed to realize that when you try to sink a salvage master, you are picking a fight with a man who knows exactly how to navigate the darkest, most treacherous waters on Earth. I walked over to the front window and stared out at the violent, churning ocean. The tide was pulling back, dragging heavy stones across the shore with a deep, grinding roar. I was not going to call the police right now. Handing this over to a local precinct would be messy, unpredictable, and subject to Chloe's manipulative social connections. No, I needed something far more devastating. I needed a strategy so comprehensive and so legally suffocating that they would never see the walls closing in until it was far too late to escape. I walked back to my desk and picked up my cell phone. I scrolled through the contacts until I found the name of the only man I trusted to help me execute a corporate execution. Thomas. My ruthless, fiercely loyal corporate attorney. We had spent 30 years destroying rival companies and outmaneuvering hostile takeovers. It was time to pull him out of his comfortable semi-retirement. I pressed the call button and listened to the line ring. They wanted to take my mind, my fleet, and my freedom. I was going to make sure they lost absolutely everything they valued, and I was going to do it without ever laying a single finger on either of them. The war had officially begun, and I held all the ammunition. The sun had not yet breached the horizon when I turned the ignition of my old truck. The coastal air was biting and thick with a salty, freezing mist, but I did not turn on the heater. I needed the cold. I needed the sharp, stinging reality of the freezing wind to keep my mind completely clear. For the past 24 hours, my entire existence had been violently uprooted. The son I had sheltered and the daughter-in-law I had funded were actively trying to strip away my freedom and lock me inside a psychiatric ward. The sorrow that had initially paralyzed my chest was completely gone. In its place was a heavy, terrifying calculation. I was driving straight into the heart of Boston, and I was going to war. Thomas Sterling was not just a corporate attorney. He was a shark who wore custom Italian suits and possessed a mind like a steel trap. We had known each other for over 30 years. Back when my salvage company was just a scrappy operation fighting against massive corporate conglomerates, Thomas was the man who helped me navigate the treacherous legal waters. He had stood by me during hostile takeovers, contract disputes, and maritime lawsuits. He knew the blood and sweat I had poured into the Hawthorne fleet. He also knew my son, Lucas. He had watched Lucas grow up. I arrived at the towering glass and steel building of his law firm just as the city was waking up. I did not bother with an appointment. I bypassed the receptionist and walked directly into his corner office overlooking the harbor. Thomas was sitting at his massive mahogany desk, reviewing a stack of contracts. When he saw my face still bearing the red, swollen marks from Chloe slapping me 13 times, he dropped his pen. He asked me what on earth had happened to me. I did not speak. I pulled the digital tablet from my jacket pocket, set it on his desk, and pressed play on the security recordings I had downloaded the night before. I watched my oldest friend listen to the audio. I watched his expression shift from confusion to absolute horror, and finally to a cold, radiating fury. He heard Chloe laughing as she meticulously outlined her plan to provoke me into a violent outburst. He heard her explicitly detail how she would use her connections to place me under an involuntary psychiatric hold, and he heard the cowardly silence of my son, followed by his pathetic agreement to sell my life away for access to my wealth. When the recording finished, the silence in the office was suffocating. Thomas slammed his hands onto his desk with such force that his coffee mug shattered against the floor. Thomas looked at me, his face pale with rage. He immediately reached for his desk phone, declaring that he was calling the district attorney and the federal authorities right that second. He wanted them arrested before lunchtime. I reached across the desk and placed my heavy, scarred hand over his phone. I pressed the receiver down, cutting the line. I told him that a quick arrest was entirely too merciful for what they were planning. I told him that before we brought down the hammer, I needed to know exactly how deep the rot had spread. I told him we needed to open the corporate ledgers immediately. Lucas was a junior board member of my fleet. If he was arrogant enough to plot my institutionalization, he was absolutely arrogant enough to have already started looting the company. Thomas understood perfectly. He summoned his top 3 forensic accountants into the private boardroom. For the next 7 hours, we locked ourselves inside that room. We drank pot after pot of bitter black coffee, while the accountants tore through decades of immaculate financial history. I sat at the head of the long glass table, staring out at the Boston skyline, feeling an unnatural stillness taking over my body. I had spent my life salvaging sunken ships from the crushing depths of the ocean. Now I was performing an autopsy on my own legacy. I was watching strangers dissect the life I had built with Helen piece by piece. As the afternoon sun began to cast long, dark shadows across the boardroom floor, the lead accountant slid a thick stack of printed ledgers toward Thomas. Thomas adjusted his glasses and began to read. I saw the color drain from his face once again. He took off his glasses, rubbed his eyes, and looked at me with an expression of profound sorrow. The betrayal was infinitely worse than a stolen retirement fund. Lucas had not just drained my personal savings, he had actively mortgaged the very soul of the Hawthorne Maritime Fleet. Thomas explained the horrific reality of the numbers. Because I had given Lucas limited signature authority to handle minor administrative duties, during my grief he had exploited a massive blind spot. Over the past 14 months, Lucas had been secretly opening massive shadow lines of credit, using my commercial salvage docks and my heavy lifting vessels as collateral. He had forged my authorization on specialized corporate loan documents, completely bypassing the standard oversight protocols. He had weaponized the pristine, debt-free reputation of my company to borrow millions upon millions of dollars from aggressive private lenders. My life work was now suffocating under a mountain of fraudulent, toxic debt. I asked Thomas where the money had gone. I knew Lucas was not investing it. The accountant turned the laptop screen toward me to show the terrifying trail of wire transfers. The funds had been funneled through a labyrinth of shell companies directly into Chloe's insatiable hands. The ledgers showed hundreds of thousands of dollars spent on European luxury vacations, private chartered flights, and custom designer jewelry. But the most devastating line item of all was a massive $2 million non-refundable deposit transferred to a premier shipyard in Italy. They were building a custom luxury yacht. A yacht they were intending to christen using the money they stole from a man who spent his life pulling actual ships out of the mud. The sheer scale of the financial betrayal hung in the room like a toxic gas. They had completely hollowed out my company. On paper, the Hawthorne fleet looked like a booming $40 million enterprise. But in reality, Lucas had secretly tied heavy concrete blocks to its ankles and kicked it over the edge of a cliff. If those hidden loans defaulted, the aggressive private lenders would swoop in and legally seize my docks, my boats, and my livelihood. They had planned to take the money and leave me locked in a padded room while the banks tore apart my legacy. Thomas stood up from his leather chair, pacing the length of the boardroom. He was practically vibrating with righteous anger. He turned to me and said that we had to go to the authorities immediately. He argued that Lucas had committed massive federal bank fraud and corporate embezzlement. He insisted that we needed to file an emergency injunction to freeze every single account, to seize their passports, and to throw them into a federal holding cell before they could spend another dime. He said they deserved to be dragged out of their house in handcuffs today. I remained entirely still in my chair. I looked at the sprawling financial ledgers scattered across the glass table. I thought about the 13 stinging slaps across my face. I thought about the heavy roll of industrial masking tape Chloe planned to put over my mouth in a psychiatric ward. I stood up slowly, buttoning my worn suit jacket. I looked Thomas directly in the eye and told him absolutely not. I told him we were not going to call the police today. We were not going to alert them to the fact that we knew everything. Thomas stopped pacing and stared at me as if I had lost my mind. I told him that an immediate arrest would give them the opportunity to play the victims. They would hire expensive defense attorneys using my own stolen money to drag out a court case for years. They would manipulate the narrative and try to escape through legal loopholes. I told Thomas that I believed in something far more permanent than a quick arrest. I believed in systemic karma. I wanted to build a trap so flawlessly designed, so legally airtight, that Chloe and Lucas would joyfully walk inside and lock the heavy iron door from the inside. I walked over to the floor-to-ceiling window and looked down at the bustling city below. I explained my strategy. If Lucas and Chloe believed their plan was succeeding, they would continue to be arrogant and sloppy. I wanted them to feel powerful. I wanted them to feel untouchable right up until the final fatal second. I turned back to Thomas and instructed him and his accounting team to begin drafting a completely silent corporate restructure. We were going to separate my clean, untouched assets from the toxic, fraudulent debt Lucas had created. We were going to build an entirely new, invisible foundation for my wealth. We were going to leave behind a hollow corporate shell, a financial ghost ship that possessed all of the toxic liability and absolutely none of the actual value. I told Thomas that when the time was right, we would legally hand over the keys to that ghost ship directly to Chloe and Lucas. We would let them sign their own names to the catastrophic debt they had created. We would let their own greed become the weapon that destroyed them. Thomas slowly sat back down in his chair. A dangerous, predatory grin spread across his face as he realized exactly what I was proposing. He understood that we were not just going to report a crime to the authorities. We were going to orchestrate a masterpiece of legal execution. The accountants immediately began pulling up blank corporate filing forms, their fingers flying across their keyboards. The atmosphere in the boardroom transformed from shock and outrage into cold, methodical preparation. I took a deep breath of the sterile office air, feeling the immense weight of the betrayal transform into absolute, unyielding purpose. The ocean had taught me how to survive the deadliest storms, and I was about to show my son and his cruel wife exactly what happens when you try to drown a man who knows how to hold his breath. The heavy fog rolled in across the harbor on Thursday morning. It swallowed the jagged coastline in a thick blanket of pale gray. I stood by the kitchen sink, washing my coffee mug, and watching the dense mist consume the commercial fishing boats anchored in the distance. The barometric pressure was dropping rapidly. After 40 years of working the volatile waters of the North Atlantic, my bones always told me when a severe storm was approaching. Today, the storm was not coming from the ocean. It was driving right up my gravel driveway. I heard the unmistakable crunch of luxury tires on crushed stone. Through the condensation on the window pane, I watched a gleaming silver European sport utility vehicle roll to a stop next to my weathered pickup truck. The engine cut off. For a long moment, nobody stepped out. They were sitting inside the leather interior, rehearsing their lines. I knew exactly what they were doing. Chloe and Lucas were preparing their faces. They were adjusting their masks. I walked into the living room and positioned myself in my old reclining armchair. I needed to set my own stage. A master of maritime salvage knows that the most dangerous part of pulling a wreck from the deep is managing the pressure. If you rise too fast, you get the bends. If you panic in the dark water, you drown. You have to control your breathing. You have to slow your heart rate down to a steady, unyielding rhythm. I took a deep breath, filling my lungs with the cold air of the cottage, and I let it out slowly. I forced my broad shoulders to round forward. I let my spine slouch. I allowed my hands to rest on my knees deliberately, creating a slight tremor in my fingers. I stripped away the posture of a man who commanded commercial fleets and wrapped myself in the fragile skin of a confused, broken, elderly man. The performance had to be absolutely flawless. The heavy wooden front door creaked open. Chloe did not even bother to knock. She stepped into the foyer, wearing a pristine white cashmere sweater and tailored trousers. She held a pink cardboard bakery box tied with a satin ribbon. Lucas trailed behind her like an obedient shadow. His shoulders were stiff, his eyes darting nervously around the small living room. He looked like a man walking into a trap, though he had no idea he was already standing in the center of one. Chloe immediately painted a bright, sorrowful smile across her face. Her voice dripped with an artificial sweetness that made my stomach turn. She called out my name, walking toward me with hurried, frantic steps, as if she had been worried sick about me. She placed the pink bakery box on the coffee table and knelt right beside my armchair. She reached out and took my rough, calloused hands in her soft, manicured fingers. Her skin was freezing cold. She looked up at me with wide, innocent eyes. She told me they had brought my favorite blueberry scones from the artisanal bakery downtown. She said they had not slept a single wink since Tuesday night. She told me they were absolutely terrified that I had driven home alone in the freezing rain. I looked at her perfectly applied makeup and her carefully styled hair. There was not a single trace of lost sleep on her face. It was a perfectly orchestrated illusion. Lucas stood awkwardly near the doorway, shifting his weight from one foot to the other. He refused to look me directly in the eye. He stared at a framed photograph of his mother on the mantelpiece instead. I wanted to shake him. I wanted to grab him by his expensive collar and demand to know how he could stand there and watch this woman plot his own father's ruin. But I kept my breathing slow and steady. I kept the tremor in my hands consistent. I looked down at Chloe and offered a weak, confused sigh. Chloe squeezed my hands tightly. She began the psychological assault with a voice so tender it felt like velvet wrapped around a blade. She told me that we needed to have a very serious conversation about what happened at the dinner party. She said my reaction had deeply terrified everyone. She leaned in closer, her toxic perfume filling my nostrils, and whispered that she knew I was struggling. Then, the gaslighting began in earnest. She looked at me with profound, fake pity and said that I had completely misunderstood the entire evening. She claimed that the 13 slaps were just a gentle family joke. She insisted that she was only playfully tapping my cheeks to help me stay awake because I had been nodding off at the table. She told me that her counting out loud was just a game we used to play, and that my declining memory had twisted a loving moment into something aggressive. She said I had hallucinated the malice. She said my brain was simply playing cruel tricks on me. I listened to the sheer audacity of her lies. She was sitting in my house looking directly into the eyes of a man who possessed high-definition audio recordings of her plotting to lock me inside a psychiatric ward. She was actively trying to rewrite reality. She was attempting to convince me that I was losing my mind so that she could seamlessly justify the medical conservatorship she was desperately trying to secure. It was a masterclass in psychological manipulation. If I had not heard those recordings with my own ears, I might have actually doubted my own sanity. I might have believed that my grief over losing Helen had finally cracked my foundation. But I knew the absolute truth. I knew she was a predator. Lucas finally stepped forward, his voice trembling slightly. He echoed his wife's poisonous script. He told me that I had overreacted. He said that I was getting older, and that the isolation of living in the coastal cottage was making me paranoid. He looked at the floor and muttered that Chloe loved me like her own father, and that it broke her heart to see me lash out so violently over a simple misunderstanding. He asked me to please just calm down and let them take care of me. The betrayal from my own son stung sharper than any physical blow. He was fully aware of the truth. He was fully aware of the massive fraudulent loans he had taken out against my fleet. He knew they were planning to flee to Dubai on a luxury yacht. Yet here he stood, looking like a concerned son trying to comfort a sick old man. I lowered my head, allowing a long, shaky breath to escape my lips. I closed my eyes and let a single tear slip down my weathered cheek. I raised my trembling hand and wiped it away, sniffing softly. I looked at Chloe with an expression of profound, weary defeat. I told her that my head had been feeling incredibly cloudy lately. I told her that sometimes I woke up and could not remember what day of the week it was. I admitted that the empty quiet of the house was making me imagine things that were not really there. Chloe's eyes widened with a predatory thrill. She tried to maintain her mask of sorrow, but I could see the greedy victory flashing in her pupils. She thought she had won. She thought she had successfully shattered my confidence in my own cognitive abilities. I leaned back against the worn fabric of the armchair, completely surrendering my posture. I told them that I was so deeply sorry for ruining the dinner party. I said my anger had gotten the best of me, and that I had acted out of pure, foolish confusion. I let my voice crack, as I told them that I did not mean a single word about canceling the $15 million inheritance. I said I was just a tired, lonely old man, lashing out because I missed Helen so terribly. I told them I did not want to lose my family over a stupid misunderstanding. Chloe immediately wrapped her arms around my neck, pulling me into a suffocating hug. She patted my back and cooed into my ear, telling me that everything was going to be perfectly fine. She said they forgave me completely, and that they were never going to abandon me. Lucas let out a massive sigh of relief, visibly relaxing his shoulders. He walked over and placed a hand on my shoulder, telling me he loved me. I swallowed the bile rising in my throat. I accepted their fake comfort, playing the role of the grateful, submissive elder to absolute perfection. I waited for the embrace to end. I let the silence stretch for a few comfortable seconds, allowing them to bask in their false victory. Then I gently patted Chloe's hand and delivered the bait. I looked at Lucas with wide, frightened eyes. I told him that the episode at the dinner party had terrified me more than anyone else. I said it made me realize that I was no longer capable of handling my own affairs. I mentioned casually that I had called Thomas the previous afternoon. I told them that I instructed my attorney to begin drafting an entirely new consolidated power of attorney document. I explained that this new document would put absolutely everything, my bank accounts, my real estate properties, and the entire commercial salvage fleet under one single legal umbrella. I told them I wanted them to have absolute and immediate control over my entire life. I said I did not trust my own mind anymore, and I needed my son to take the wheel before I accidentally destroyed the family legacy. The reaction was immediate and electric. Chloe completely stopped breathing for a full second. Her entire body went rigid with absolute shock and pure, unadulterated greed. She stared at me, her mouth slightly open, trying to process the magnitude of what I had just offered. I had just handed her the keys to the entire kingdom. I had just removed every single legal obstacle standing between her and a $40 million maritime empire. She did not even have to go through the messy, complicated process of an involuntary psychiatric hold. I was volunteering to sign my life away. Lucas looked equally stunned. He swallowed hard, his eyes darting toward his wife for confirmation on how to react. Chloe recovered her composure with terrifying speed. She squeezed my hand with renewed, frantic energy. She told me that I was making the smartest, safest decision possible. She praised my wisdom. She assured me that Lucas was the perfect man to take over the heavy burdens of the corporate fleet. She promised that they would protect my assets and ensure that I lived out the rest of my days in absolute comfort and peace. I nodded slowly, offering them a weak, grateful smile. I told them that Thomas would have the consolidated power of attorney documents ready for my final signature by next Friday. I said I wanted to do it properly in his downtown boardroom with everyone present, so that the transition of power would be legally flawless and officially recorded. I asked them if they would be willing to accompany me to the law firm to finalize the paperwork. Chloe practically vibrated with anticipation. She eagerly nodded her head, promising that they would absolutely be there. She told me they would handle all the transportation and that they would even bring her sister Brenda along to witness the beautiful family moment. They were so blinded by the sheer scale of the incoming wealth that they did not question a single detail. They did not pause to consider why a man who had commanded aggressive salvage crews for 4 decades was suddenly surrendering his entire life without a fight. They only saw the money. They stayed for another 20 minutes, pouring me coffee and chatting about meaningless, trivial things. They played the role of the loving, devoted children to absolute perfection. They left the pink bakery box on the table and finally stood up to leave. Chloe kissed my cheek, her lips cold against my skin. Lucas gave my shoulder one last reassuring squeeze. They promised to call me later that evening and walked out the front door. I sat perfectly still in my armchair, listening to the heavy wooden door click shut. I listened to their footsteps crunch across the gravel driveway. I heard the doors of the luxury sport utility vehicle slam shut and the powerful engine roar to life. I did not move until the sound of their tires faded completely into the thick coastal fog. When the absolute silence returned to the cottage, the fragile, confused old man completely vanished. My posture straightened. My broad shoulders rolled back. The tremor in my hands stopped, instantly replaced by the steady iron grip of a man preparing to execute a flawless demolition. I stood up from the armchair and walked over to the coffee table. I picked up the pink bakery box, walked into the kitchen, and dropped the expensive artisan scones directly into the garbage bin. I walked to the kitchen window and stared out at the dark, violent waves crashing against the rocky cliffs below my property. The trap was perfectly set. The bait had been swallowed whole. Chloe and Lucas were currently driving back to their mansion, completely convinced that they had outsmarted a senile fisherman. They were likely calculating exactly how quickly they could finalize the purchase of their luxury Italian yacht. They believed they were days away from absolute control. They had no idea that the consolidated power of attorney document Thomas was drafting was not designed to give them my empire. It was designed to legally bind their names to the catastrophic fraudulent debt Lucas had secretly created. It was the ultimate corporate guillotine. They were going to walk into that boardroom expecting a coronation, and they were going to walk out in federal handcuffs. I took a deep breath of the cold air, feeling the immense, heavy satisfaction of a storm finally breaking. The final countdown had officially begun. High above the sleeping city, the fluorescent lights of Thomas and his legal team burned long past midnight. The air inside the downtown conference room was thick with the bitter scent of stale espresso and mountains of printed financial ledgers. We were operating on pure adrenaline and righteous fury, pushing through grueling 18-hour days. While my attorney and I dismantled the very foundation of my life, my son and his cruel wife were busy spending imaginary money. Thomas had a few discreet contacts in the luxury maritime brokerage world. They informed him that Lucas and Chloe had spent their entire afternoon at an exclusive private marina. They were enthusiastically touring a $5 million custom Italian yacht. They were running their greedy hands over imported mahogany steering consoles, examining pristine teakwood decks, and selecting premium leather upholstery for the main cabin. Chloe was apparently demanding a bespoke champagne chiller and a custom entertainment system for the master suite. They were behaving like royalty, casually measuring the drapes for a magnificent vessel they fully expected my institutionalization to finance. They were utterly intoxicated by their own arrogance. They truly believed I was sitting in my lonely coastal cottage, helplessly losing my mind and waiting for the final curtain to fall. They had no idea that the confused old fisherman they had mocked was currently orchestrating their absolute destruction. My hands were cramped and aching from signing endless stacks of preliminary authorizations, but I refused to stop. I looked across the wide glass table at Thomas. He had assembled a small army of his most brilliant corporate architects and forensic tax specialists. We were not merely hiding my fortune. We were engineering a lethal financial weapon out of the very fraud my son had committed. Lucas had used his junior board position to leverage my pristine business reputation. He had secured massive predatory lines of credit by quietly pledging my commercial docks and my heavy lifting vessels as collateral. He had forged my signature on documents that tied the massive debt directly to a specific subsidiary holding company under the corporate umbrella. Thomas and I needed to perform an incredibly delicate surgery. We had to extract the healthy beating heart of my life work and leave the cancerous debt behind. I gave the absolute order to quietly dissolve the primary corporate structures that tethered my clean assets to the poisoned subsidiary. We invoked the deepest principles of silent wealth. For decades, Helen and I had deliberately kept our personal names detached from our heaviest commercial holdings, utilizing a complex web of discrete corporate entities to protect our privacy. That long-standing paranoia was now my greatest advantage. Because the wealth was already decentralized, Thomas could initiate massive asset transfers without triggering any public alarms or raising a single warning at the local banks. The true assets of the commercial fleet were massive and undeniable. We possessed deep water salvage vessels, commercial dry docks, heavy crane barges, and prime waterfront real estate scattered across the entire eastern seaboard. Piece by piece, we quietly carved every single legitimate asset out of the original corporate structure. I sat back in my leather chair and watched Thomas draft the creation of a blind, irrevocable offshore trust. Once an asset goes into a trust like this, it legally ceases to belong to me. It becomes an independent, untouchable entity governed by strict, unyielding rules. I decided right then and there to name it the Helen Hawthorne Foundation. It was the ultimate tribute to the brilliant, loving woman who had helped me pull my very first rusted boat out of the coastal mud. I directed the entire $40 million fortune into this ironclad vault. I stipulated that the trust would indefinitely fund two specific causes. The first half would go toward marine conservation efforts to protect the wild, unpredictable ocean that had given me my livelihood, focusing specifically on restoring damaged coastal reefs. The second half was dedicated to establishing a massive legal defense endowment for elderly individuals facing financial exploitation and domestic abuse. I wanted to ensure that no older person ever had to sit at a dinner table and endure the humiliation I had suffered simply because they lacked the resources to fight back. I felt a profound sense of peace wash over my exhausted body as I signed those specific transfer pages. The ink drying on the thick parchment felt like a heavy iron chain lifting off my shoulders. Even if Chloe somehow managed to succeed in her wicked plot to have me declared medically incompetent, it would not matter anymore. A medical conservatorship only grants control over assets that I personally own and control. By moving my empire into an irrevocable offshore trust, I was legally transforming myself into a penniless man on paper. Chloe could manipulate the local authorities. She could bribe doctors. She could lock me in a white padded room for the rest of my natural life, but she would never be able to touch a single rusted bolt belonging to my fleet. The billions of drops of sweat and blood I had poured into the ocean were forever protected from her greedy manicured hands. I had effectively severed the main artery of their fraudulent financial plan. But I was not simply going to walk away and leave them empty-handed. A true salvage master knows how to use the crushing weight of the ocean to destroy a compromised hull. We had extracted the wealth, but we needed to leave the trap perfectly intact. Thomas and his brilliant legal team meticulously constructed a financial ghost ship. We maintained the front-facing shell of the original holding company. We kept the corporate letterhead, the registered business address, and the impressive-sounding tax identification numbers. To a careless, greedy observer like my son, this holding company still looked exactly like a flourishing $40 million maritime empire. But beneath the shiny surface, it was completely, entirely hollow. The only things we left tethered to this specific corporate shell were the catastrophic shadow loans, the predatory private debts, and the toxic liabilities that Lucas had illegally forged. We packed the ghost ship to the absolute brim with his own financial poison. The legal trap was remarkably elegant in its absolute poetic cruelty. Whoever held the ultimate signatory rights to this specific holding company would not inherit a magnificent fleet of working ships. They would immediately inherit millions of dollars in fraudulent federal debt. They would become instantly and personally liable for the massive embezzlement scheme Lucas had orchestrated to fund his wife's lavish lifestyle. We were building a magnificent golden door that opened directly into a roaring furnace. The sheer volume of fraudulent paperwork we uncovered during those marathon 18-hour sessions was staggering. Lucas had not just borrowed money against the physical ships, he had actively mortgaged the future commercial contracts we had secured with major coastal shipping conglomerates. He had stolen millions of dollars that were supposed to guarantee the livelihoods of my loyal dock workers and my veteran salvage crews. My men, the rough, decent people who had risked their lives alongside me during brutal ocean storms, were completely, entirely vulnerable because of my son's pathetic greed. Knowing that Lucas was willing to destroy the lives of innocent working families just to keep his vicious wife draped in expensive diamonds ignited a new level of fury inside me. It validated every single harsh, aggressive legal maneuver Thomas and I were currently executing. I was no longer just protecting my own freedom and my own legacy. I was actively defending the hundreds of hard-working people who depended on the Hawthorne maritime fleet to feed their own children. I owed it to my men to completely eradicate the toxic infection that Lucas and Chloe had brought into our enterprise. I was going to surgically remove the cancer and throw it directly into the fire. I walked over to the long glass wall of the boardroom and pressed my forehead against the cool pane. Below me, the city streets were entirely empty, save for a few delivery trucks moving through the lingering shadows. I closed my eyes and pictured Lucas. I pictured the little boy who used to run down the docks in oversized rubber boots, begging to help me tie the mooring lines. I remembered the pride I felt when he graduated with honors, completely free of the crushing student debt that paralyzed his peers. I had given him the world on a silver platter. I had smoothed every rough edge of his existence, hoping he would grow into a strong, compassionate man. Instead, he had allowed a vain, cruel woman to completely hollow out his spine. He had watched her strike my face 13 times, and he had stared at his plate. He had agreed to lock me in a psychiatric ward so they could steal the very legacy I built for him. The immense tragic sorrow of that realization threatened to swallow me whole, but I refused to let it pull me under. I locked the grief away in a dark corner of my mind. I was a man of the sea, and the sea does not tolerate weakness or hesitation. Thomas approached me holding 2 steaming mugs of coffee. He handed me one and stood by my side, looking out at the waking city. We did not speak for a long time. There was no need for words. We had spent our youth fighting side by side in crowded courtrooms and hostile negotiation tables. He knew the massive emotional toll this operation was taking on my soul, but he also knew that it was absolutely necessary. He took a sip of his bitter coffee and quietly informed me that the final paperwork for the ghost ship was complete. The fraudulent holding company was now completely isolated, waiting in the dark like a hungry predator. All we needed now was for Lucas and Chloe to eagerly sign their names to the ownership transfer documents. We needed them to claim the throne they thought they had stolen. Thomas warned me that the moment they signed those papers, the trap would spring shut with catastrophic force. The predatory private lenders would instantly be alerted to the transfer of ownership. The massive hidden debts would immediately become due in full. The federal authorities would swoop in to investigate the forged signatures on the original loan documents. It would be a total unmitigated financial and legal bloodbath. I took a slow, deep breath of the harsh black coffee, letting the bitter warmth spread through my chest. I turned to Thomas and gave him a slow, resolute nod. I told him that a bloodbath was exactly what they had ordered when they decided to strike an old man at a dinner table. We walked back to the conference table, where the stack of beautifully bound legal documents sat waiting under the bright fluorescent lights. They looked so official, so incredibly valuable. Any greedy, socially climbing parasite would eagerly snatch the pen to sign them without bothering to read the fine print. Chloe and Lucas were out there right now dreaming of their $5 million yacht, completely oblivious to the fact that they were actively dancing on a trap door. They thought they had secured their glamorous future by betraying my unconditional love. They had absolutely no idea that their entire lavish existence was about to evaporate into thin air. I reached out and gently tapped the thick, leather-bound portfolio. I felt a cold, absolute certainty settle deep within my bones. The trap was armed and the bait was irresistible. The only thing left to do was send out the formal invitations to the final estate signing and watch the rats rush eagerly toward the sinking ship. The bitter chill of the Atlantic morning was biting at my face as I stood on the wooden planks of the old commercial pier. I was running my hands over the thick braided mooring lines of my oldest salvage vessel, checking for fraying fibers, when my cell phone vibrated violently against my ribs. I pulled it from my heavy canvas jacket and saw Thomas calling. Thomas never called before 8 in the morning unless the sky was falling. I answered the phone and immediately noticed that his usual calm, collected corporate tone was completely gone. His voice was tight, sharp, and entirely devoid of pleasantries. He told me to drop whatever I was doing, get into my truck, and drive straight to his downtown office immediately. He said the timeline had ruptured, and we were suddenly racing against a loaded gun. I did not ask questions. A man who has spent 40 years navigating violent ocean storms knows that when the barometer drops, you secure the hatches and move. I threw my truck into gear and drove toward Boston, breaking every speed limit on the coastal highway. My mind raced through a dozen different catastrophic scenarios, but absolutely nothing could have prepared me for the sickening piece of paper Thomas slid across his polished mahogany desk the moment I walked through his office door. Thomas had utilized his extensive network of legal clerks to monitor any unsealed court activity involving my name or my fleet. That morning, a clerk in a neighboring county courthouse had flagged a highly unusual expedited filing. Chloe had not waited for the consolidated power of attorney document I had promised her. Her toxic greed and unyielding arrogance had pushed her to accelerate her own malicious timeline. She had quietly submitted an emergency medical directive and a petition for involuntary conservatorship. She was attempting to seize absolute legal control over my body, my finances, and my entire commercial shipping empire. I sat in the heavy leather chair across from Thomas and picked up the printed copy of her petition. My hands, calloused from decades of hauling heavy steel chains, began to shake, not from fear, but from a deep, radiating fury. The document was a masterpiece of absolute fiction. Chloe had deliberately bypassed the strict impartial judges in our primary district and filed the petition in a neighboring jurisdiction presided over by a notoriously sympathetic local judge named Harrison. Judge Harrison was a man who owed his entire political career to the wealthy elite country club social circles that Chloe desperately courted. He was known for rubber stamping emergency orders for prominent families without asking too many difficult questions. I read through the forged documents and felt the blood pounding in my temples. Chloe had submitted a completely fabricated psychiatric evaluation. The paperwork bore the forged signature of a physician I had not visited in over a decade. The clinical notes painted a horrifying and entirely false picture of my mental state. It described me as a violently unpredictable elderly man suffering from rapid onset dementia and severe paranoid delusions. It claimed that my grief over losing my beloved Helen had completely shattered my grip on reality. But the most repulsive part of the entire forged filing was her twisted account of the dinner party. Chloe had written a sworn affidavit claiming that I had suffered a massive psychological break at her dining room table. She testified under penalty of perjury that I had violently destroyed the dining room, smashed expensive crystal glasses, and aggressively threatened her guests. She claimed that she had been forced to physically restrain me for my own safety and the safety of my son. She had expertly taken her own vicious physical assault, her cruel game of 13 slaps, and entirely reversed the narrative to make herself look like a brave, terrified victim protecting a deranged old man. I put the paperwork down on the glass table and looked at Thomas. The air in the room felt incredibly thin. The reality of the situation hit my chest like a heavy iron anvil. This was no longer just a battle over a $15 million inheritance or the protection of my corporate assets. This was a battle for my fundamental human freedom. If Judge Harrison signed that emergency order, I would instantly become a legal ghost. I would be stripped of all my autonomous rights. I would not be allowed to sign a check, drive my truck, or make a single decision regarding my own health care. Lucas and Chloe could legally arrive at my coastal cottage with armed medical escorts, drag me out of my own home, and lock me inside a sterile, heavily sedated psychiatric facility before the sun went down. Thomas leaned forward, resting his elbows on his desk. He explained that we had completely underestimated their capacity for absolute evil. They were not simply waiting for me to hand over the keys to the kingdom. They were actively building a prison to throw me into. The elaborate legal trap we had been carefully constructing the hollowed-out ghost ship of a holding company loaded with their fraudulent debt was suddenly in jeopardy. If they secured the conservatorship, they would gain the legal authority to halt all of our corporate restructuring. We were entirely out of time. The slow, methodical burn of systemic karma had to be instantly accelerated. I told Thomas that I refused to be a victim. I refused to let my cowardly son and his vicious wife dictate the terms of my existence. I asked him exactly what we needed to do to crush the petition and sever their fingers from my life. Thomas told me we needed to prove beyond a shadow of a doubt that my mind was immaculate. We needed overwhelming, irrefutable medical evidence to completely obliterate their forged documents, and we needed to gather it in less than 48 hours before Judge Harrison could slam his gavel down and approve the emergency order. For the next 3 days, I lived inside a grueling medical gauntlet. Thomas leveraged every single high-level connection he possessed in the Boston medical community. He pulled favors cashed in old debts and managed to book emergency priority appointments with 3 independent, highly respected, board-certified psychiatrists. These were not local doctors who could be swayed by country club politics. These were top-tier clinical experts affiliated with the most prestigious medical institutions in the state. I walked into their sterile clinical offices, knowing that my entire freedom depended on my performance. I sat across from brilliant evaluating physicians and submitted myself to rigorous, exhaustive cognitive testing. They asked me to draw overlapping geometric shapes from memory. They gave me lists of disconnected words and asked me to repeat them backward an hour later. They tested my spatial awareness, my logical reasoning, and my emotional stability. I did not just pass their tests, I completely dominated them. I remained perfectly calm, exceptionally polite, and terrifyingly articulate. When one psychiatrist asked me about my professional background to gauge my memory retention, I did not just give him a brief summary. I laid out the precise structural engineering requirements for raising a sunken commercial barge. I recited the exact logistical supply chain costs for running a deep water salvage operation, detailing fuel expenditures, payroll distributions, and municipal dock fees down to the specific cent. I spoke about my late wife Helen with clarity and profound respect, showing that my grief was a natural, healthy process and not a symptom of cognitive decay. I proved to every single physician in those rooms that my mind was sharper than the heavy steel hooks I used to haul cargo. I demonstrated that I possessed the unyielding mental fortitude of a man who had built a $40 million empire from scratch. By the end of the third day, every single psychiatrist shook my hand with absolute respect. They each drafted and signed a sworn legally binding affidavit attesting to my perfect cognitive health, flawless memory, and pristine mental acuity. They specifically noted that any claim of dementia or emotional instability was entirely baseless and medically impossible. I brought those 3 golden affidavits back to Thomas. We sat in his office looking at the stack of certified medical documents that proved my absolute sanity. But Thomas knew that simply defending myself was not enough. If we publicly challenged Chloe's petition in open court, it would tip our hand. It would alert her to the fact that we knew about her forgery and give her the opportunity to retreat and formulate a new strategy. We needed to neutralize the threat without making a single sound. We needed to let her believe she was still winning. Thomas executed a brilliant, devastating legal counterstrike in total secrecy. He took the 3 immaculate psychiatric affidavits and compiled them with the security footage from my home, proving Chloe had maliciously planned the false institutionalization. He did not file a standard public motion. Instead, he utilized a highly specialized sealed administrative injunction directly through the state appellate court, completely bypassing the corrupt local judge. Thomas personally contacted Judge Harrison in his private chambers. He did not make threats. He simply presented the undeniable facts. He informed the judge that the medical directive submitted by Chloe Hawthorne was a documented criminal forgery. He presented the undeniable proof of my pristine mental health and the video evidence of Chloe admitting to the fraudulent scheme. Thomas casually mentioned that if Judge Harrison chose to proceed with the emergency conservatorship hearing, he would personally ensure that a federal investigation into the judge's courtroom practices and social affiliations would be launched before the end of the week. The corrupt judge practically tripped over himself to back away from the blast zone. He immediately and quietly buried Chloe's petition, placing it under a permanent administrative seal. He indefinitely suspended the emergency hearing, ensuring that the order would never see the light of day. But the true genius of Thomas's maneuver was the absolute silence of it all. He specifically legally bound the court from notifying Chloe's legal team about the injunction. Chloe was left entirely in the dark. She received no notification of the rejection. She still firmly believed that her emergency order was quietly winding its way through the local legal system. She still thought the noose was successfully tightening around my neck. She and Lucas continued their arrogant shopping sprees, completely convinced that they were only days away from watching medical orderlies drag me out of my coastal cottage. They were entirely oblivious to the fact that their greatest weapon had just been quietly dismantled and turned into the very evidence that would soon send them to federal prison. I walked out of Thomas's office that evening and breathed in the crisp, cool air of the city. The terrifying ticking clock had been smashed. My autonomy was completely secured. I was a free man walking the streets with the total weight of the law firmly backing my sanity. The temporary panic had evaporated, leaving behind an unshakable concrete resolve. The defensive maneuvers were officially over. The ghost ship holding company was fully loaded with their fraudulent, toxic debt. The video evidence of their abuse and forgery was secured in a federal vault. The stage was perfectly set. It was time to invite my son and his vicious wife to the grand finale and watch them eagerly pull the lever on their own destruction. The salt air of the commercial harbor always smelled like hard work and survival. I stood on the rusted steel grating of Pier 4 long before the sun even thought about rising over the Atlantic horizon. The water below the docks was black and churning violently against the thick wooden pilings. I had called an emergency meeting with the men who actually kept the Hawthorne Maritime Fleet breathing. These were not men who wore expensive tailored suits or drank imported wine at high society dinner parties. These were men with deep, permanent lines etched into their faces from decades of fighting the brutal ocean winds. Captain Barrett and Captain Sullivan had been with me since the very beginning of my career. They were standing by my side 30 years ago when we pulled a massive sunken commercial freighter out of the suffocating coastal mud. They knew my late wife, Helen. They knew exactly how much blood and sweat we had sacrificed to build this company from a single rusted boat into a massive regional empire. I met them inside the old corrugated steel warehouse where we kept our heavy diving gear and our thickest salvage chains. The air inside the massive building was thick with the scent of engine grease, damp neoprene, and cold steel. I did not waste their time with pleasantries or small talk. I looked at these two men who were like brothers to me, and I told them the absolute horrifying truth. I explained that my own son Lucas and his wife Chloe had attempted to steal the entire commercial fleet. I told them about the forged bank documents, the toxic fraudulent debt, and the horrific plan to have me locked inside a psychiatric ward. I did not mention the humiliating dinner party or the 13 slaps across my face because an old man still has his pride. But I told them enough to make their jaws tighten with profound protective anger. Barrett is a giant of a man with a thick gray beard and a temper like a Category 5 hurricane. He crushed his heavy thermos of coffee in his massive hand and asked me exactly what I needed them to do. I pulled a thick stack of legal injunctions from my heavy canvas jacket. Thomas had drafted these specific documents overnight. They were absolute, unyielding legal mandates completely revoking every single ounce of authority Lucas held over the physical docks, the commercial warehouses, and the salvage vessels. I handed the heavy manila folders to my loyal captains. I instructed them to go to every single commercial property we owned across the eastern seaboard. I told them to use heavy bolt cutters to remove the old padlocks and install solid steel deadbolts on every single gate. I ordered them to completely deactivate my son's digital administrative access cards. I told them to personally inform the armed dock security teams that Lucas was officially trespassing if he stepped one single foot onto the concrete piers. I wanted him entirely locked out of the physical empire. I wanted to ensure that he could not move a single piece of heavy machinery or access a single commercial vessel once the federal hammer finally dropped. Sullivan took the folders from my hands with a grim, resolute nod. He looked me directly in the eye and told me that Lucas would not even be allowed to look at the ocean without their express permission. Within 3 short hours, the entire physical infrastructure of the Hawthorne fleet was completely locked down. My son was effectively exiled from the massive kingdom he thought he owned, and he had absolutely no idea it had even happened. With the physical docks completely secured and fortified, my next move required a very different kind of absolute ruthlessness. I drove away from the gritty industrial harbor and headed straight toward the towering, intimidating federal building located in the very heart of the city. I was not dealing with corrupt local precinct politics or easily manipulated country club judges anymore. Forging signatures on commercial maritime bank loans is a massive federal crime. It involves crossing state lines, defrauding federally insured institutions, and directly manipulating international maritime commerce laws. It was the exact kind of high-level financial crime that brought down entire corporate syndicates and put greedy executives behind bars for decades. Thomas had utilized his extensive legal network to arrange a highly classified private meeting with a senior federal fraud investigator named Agent Caldwell. Caldwell was a sharp, serious man with tired, observant eyes and a perfectly pressed gray suit. We sat in a sterile, windowless government conference room under harsh, bright, fluorescent lights. I reached into my battered leather briefcase and placed 3 massive, meticulously organized leather binders onto the cold metal table. These heavy binders contained the complete forensic autopsy of my son's financial treason. I did not feel any sense of joy or victory as I slid those binders across the table toward the federal agent. A deep, heavy, agonizing sorrow settled in the very bottom of my chest. I was intentionally handing my only child over to the federal government, knowing he would likely face decades in a concrete cell. But I forced my mind to remember the hidden camera footage. I remembered Chloe maliciously torturing my disabled grandson while Lucas casually sipped his expensive bourbon and happily agreed to throw me into a locked, padded room. The sorrow inside my heart instantly hardened into solid, unbreakable iron. I owed my grandson a safe, bright future, and I owed my loyal, hard-working employees their guaranteed pensions. I could not allow a weak, cowardly boy to destroy innocent lives just to finance a luxury Italian yacht for a wicked woman. I sat across from Agent Caldwell and systematically laid out the entire elaborate embezzlement scheme. I spoke with the precise, calculated logic of a veteran salvage master analyzing a highly complex shipwreck. I showed the federal agent exactly how Lucas had exploited his junior board position to bypass the standard corporate oversight protocols. I pointed out the specific forged signatures on the multi-million-dollar commercial loan applications. I provided the undeniable verified proof that the stolen funds had been illegally funneled through a labyrinth of offshore shell companies to purchase international luxury assets. But the most crucial part of this entire federal meeting was establishing the absolute legal firewall. I had to permanently and legally separate my own clean, legitimate legacy from the toxic radioactive waste Lucas had recklessly created. I walked the federal agent through the extensive corporate restructuring that Thomas and I had finalized just days prior. I proved through verified tax documents that the genuine assets of the Hawthorne fleet were safely locked inside an irrevocable offshore trust dedicated entirely to charitable causes. I demonstrated beyond a shadow of a doubt that the holding company Lucas was currently operating was nothing more than a hollow financial ghost ship entirely isolated from my legitimate business. Agent Caldwell spent 4 grueling hours reviewing the dense financial documents. He cross-referenced the wire transfers and verified the forged bank signatures against my actual legal records. When he finally looked up from the binders, his expression was one of absolute professional shock. He told me that my son had orchestrated a spectacular level of undeniable fraud, and that the evidence I provided was completely bulletproof. He promised me that federal arrest warrants for both Lucas and Chloe would be drafted and signed immediately by a federal judge. The trap was now fully armed with federal steel. The final piece of the puzzle required a masterstroke of psychological manipulation. I needed to lure Chloe and Lucas into a highly controlled environment where they could not escape, where they could not cause a public scene, and where the federal authorities could execute the arrest with maximum efficiency. I drove directly to Thomas's downtown corporate law firm to expertly craft the final bait. We sat in his luxurious corner office and drafted a formal legal invitation. The document was printed on incredibly expensive, heavy cream-colored cardstock that felt weighty and important. It bore the prestigious gold-embossed seal of Thomas's corporate law firm. The language we chose was exceptionally polite, overly formal, and utterly deceptive. It formally invited Lucas and Chloe to attend a final estate signing ceremony on Friday afternoon. The elegant invitation explicitly stated that the sole purpose of the meeting was to finalize the consolidated power of attorney and to legally transfer the primary executive control of the holding company directly into their eager hands. I knew Chloe's bottomless vanity and insatiable greed would completely blind her to any potential danger. To perfectly sweeten the trap, I included a specific handwritten note encouraging Chloe to bring her sister Brenda along to witness the historic family transition. Chloe absolutely loved an audience. She thrived on making other people deeply envious of her unearned wealth. Giving her the opportunity to flaunt her new supposed billionaire status in front of her equally snobby sister was a temptation she could never possibly resist. We hired a private bonded courier to hand-deliver the elegant envelope directly to the massive suburban mansion I had bought for them. Later that evening, I sat in my quiet coastal cottage and opened the security camera portal on my laptop. I watched the live high-definition feed from their grand marble foyer as the uniformed courier handed the thick cream envelope to Chloe. I watched her tear it open with frantic, greedy fingers. I watched her perfectly manicured hands shake with excitement as she read the words, "Final Estate Signing." A massive, triumphant smile spread across her face. She practically screamed with joy, calling Lucas down the sweeping staircase to share the victorious news. She hugged him, jumping up and down, completely convinced that they had successfully conquered the senile old fisherman. She immediately picked up her smartphone and began rapidly dialing. I knew without a shadow of a doubt that she was calling Brenda to brag about her incoming fortune. She was eagerly reserving her front row seat to her own absolute destruction. I closed the laptop screen and walked out onto my back porch. The harsh coastal storm from the morning had completely cleared, leaving a vast sky full of cold, brilliant stars. The dark ocean crashed against the jagged rocks below, producing a steady, powerful rhythm that perfectly matched my own heartbeat. Everything was perfectly aligned. The commercial docks were secured. The federal arrest warrants were signed and waiting. The invitations were eagerly accepted by the greedy targets. The incredibly heavy steel blade of the guillotine was raised high into the air, and the rope was finally ready to be cut. The mahogany table in Thomas's downtown Boston boardroom was polished to such an immaculate high gloss that it perfectly reflected the heavy gray storm clouds gathering outside the floor-to-ceiling windows. I had arrived at the towering glass and steel building nearly an hour early. I desperately needed to sit in the absolute, deafening silence of that magnificent room and feel the crushing weight of the moment before the circus officially began. 40 years ago, I was a young, desperate man pulling rusted scrap metal out of freezing coastal mud with bleeding fingers and a broken manual winch. I had built an entire maritime empire from absolute nothing, using nothing but sheer willpower and the unyielding support of my late wife Helen. Today, I was sitting at the very pinnacle of corporate power, preparing to execute a legal maneuver that would obliterate my own flesh and blood. The contrast was entirely surreal and deeply agonizing. Thomas sat quietly beside me, reviewing the final pages of the lethal documents we had engineered. He wore his darkest navy suit, serving as his personal armor for the boardroom. Neither of us spoke. The central air conditioning hummed a low, steady drone that sounded remarkably like the distant engine of a heavy salvage vessel cutting through deep, dark water. I looked down at my hands resting on my lap. They were severely scarred, thick, and permanently stained with decades of marine grease. They were the hands of a builder, a provider, and a protector. They were never meant to be the hands of an executioner. Yet life has a terrifying way of forcing you to completely dismantle the very things you spent your entire existence putting together. Right on the stroke of 2 in the afternoon, the heavy frosted glass doors of the boardroom swung wide open. The sudden influx of noise and chaotic movement completely shattered the pristine, sterile silence of the room. Chloe led the charge. She marched through the double doors with the terrifying, overwhelming confidence of a conquering queen returning to claim her absolute spoils. She was flanked on her right by her husband, my son Lucas, and on her left by her older sister Brenda. The sheer radiating arrogance pouring off the three of them was thick enough to choke on. Chloe was wearing a stark white designer dress that looked entirely too crisp and aggressively expensive for a simple legal meeting. It was an outfit chosen specifically to intimidate, to project an aura of untouchable, wealthy superiority. A heavy, intricate gold necklace rested against her collarbone, perfectly matching the heavy gold bracelets clinking loudly on her wrists. She practically vibrated with a manic, barely contained electrical energy. She firmly believed she had won the absolute lottery, and she wanted everyone in the building to know it. Lucas followed half a step behind her, looking exactly like a terrified, obedient lapdog. He wore a brand new, perfectly tailored gray suit, clearly purchased with the fraudulent funds he had stolen from my working fleet. Despite his expensive clothing, his posture was entirely hollow. He kept his eyes fixed nervously on the panoramic view of the Boston harbor, violently adjusting his silk tie every few seconds. He could not bring himself to look me directly in the eye. The crushing guilt and the pathetic cowardice were eating him alive from the inside, but his desperate desire for a life of easy, unearned luxury kept his mouth completely shut. Brenda brought up the rear of the procession. She was a slightly older, sharper, and more deeply cynical version of Chloe, possessing the exact same breed of venomous entitlement. Brenda cast a slow, highly judgmental gaze around the elegant boardroom, visually evaluating the expensive leather chairs, the imported wood paneling, and the abstract corporate art hanging on the walls. She sneered slightly, letting out a soft scoff, as if she found the multi-million-dollar law firm barely adequate for her majestic presence. Chloe quickly spotted me sitting quietly at the far end of the massive table. She immediately deployed a sickeningly sweet smile that made my stomach aggressively turn with absolute disgust. She rushed forward, her expensive designer heels clicking sharply and rapidly against the polished hardwood floor. She leaned directly over my leather chair, wrapping her arms tightly around my neck and pressing her freezing cold cheek against mine. She loudly exclaimed to the entire room how wonderful it was to see me looking so remarkably relaxed and well-rested. The heavy perfume she wore was cloying and suffocatingly floral, a completely synthetic scent that desperately tried to mask the absolute rot festering in her soul. I kept my breathing incredibly slow and measured, forcing my neck and shoulder muscles to remain entirely limp. I offered her the weak, hesitant nod of an exhausted, confused elderly man who had finally surrendered his fight. I played the pathetic, submissive role they expected to absolute perfection. Thomas stood up from his chair, buttoning his suit jacket with smooth, practiced professionalism. He greeted the trio with a polite, rigid formality, completely betraying absolutely nothing of the lethal financial trap he had constructed. He gestured gracefully toward the plush leather chairs across the table, inviting them to sit and make themselves comfortable. Brenda immediately claimed a premier seat near the window, crossing her legs, and resting her expensive designer handbag squarely on the mahogany surface, as if she owned the entire commercial building. Lucas sank heavily into the chair next to her, pulling out a silver pen and staring blankly at the yellow legal pad placed in front of him. Chloe took the absolute center seat directly across from me. She leaned forward, resting her elbows aggressively on the table, folding her hands together with an expression of intense, greedy anticipation. She stared at the blank space in front of her, as if she were waiting for a massive feast to be served. The sheer, unadulterated audacity of the woman was genuinely mesmerizing to witness. She truly believed that all of this, the high-powered lawyers, the magnificent high-rise office, the beautiful sweeping ocean view, was simply her inherent birthright. She firmly believed she had successfully gaslit a veteran salvage master into handing over a $40 million maritime empire without a single drop of resistance. I watched her pupils dilate with hunger as Thomas calmly signaled for his junior associates to bring in the final paperwork. 3 young, sharply dressed lawyers walked silently into the room, carrying thick, heavy, leather-bound portfolios. They placed one directly in front of Thomas and another directly in front of Chloe. The physical weight of the portfolio hitting the table produced a deep, highly satisfying thud. That heavy thud was the sound of my life work being laid out for the slaughter. It was also the distinct, unmistakable sound of the steel trap door unlatching beneath their feet. Chloe simply could not take the money in silence. Her bottomless vanity demanded an audience. Her fragile ego required a massive public victory lap. She looked around the room, locking her sharp eyes with Thomas and the young junior associates. She offered them a deeply condescending smile, heavily laced with completely fabricated sorrow. She smoothed the front of her white dress and announced to the room that this was such an incredibly bittersweet day for the entire Hawthorne family. She claimed that taking over the heavy, crushing burdens of the commercial fleet was a terrifying responsibility, but one they were absolutely ready and willing to shoulder. She gestured toward me with a slow, dismissive wave of her manicured hand. She spoke to the room as if I were completely deaf or entirely incapable of comprehending basic human language. She loudly and confidently declared that it was simply a monumental tragedy how quickly the human mind can deteriorate. She sighed dramatically, looking directly at Brenda for sympathetic validation. She stated that after decades of grueling manual labor on the docks and the tragic, unexpected loss of my dear wife, my cognitive faculties had simply slipped away much faster than anyone could have ever predicted. She looked directly at Thomas, her voice dripping with poisonous, patronizing authority. She told him that it is always best for the old guard to graciously step down before they accidentally hurt themselves or destroy the beautiful things they spent their lives building. She said it was a profound act of family mercy that she and Lucas were stepping in to rescue the company from my rapidly declining mental state. She practically nominated herself for a humanitarian award right there in the center of the boardroom. I sat perfectly still, listening to her absolutely butcher my reputation and my legacy. She was actively building a completely false narrative of my senility in front of federal witnesses. She was cementing her own profound guilt with every single arrogant syllable that escaped her lips. Lucas shifted incredibly uncomfortably in his chair, finally chancing a quick, nervous glance in my direction. I made sure to immediately meet his gaze. I let my eyes widen slightly, projecting a hollow, deeply confused vulnerability. I watched him quickly look away, unable to stomach the sight of the father he was actively betraying. Brenda chimed in, completely agreeing with her sister. Brenda loudly proclaimed that managing significant commercial wealth requires a sharp, modern, highly sophisticated mind. She openly implied that an uneducated fisherman like myself never truly belonged in these high-level corporate spaces to begin with, and that it was high time the money was managed by people with actual class and vision. Thomas allowed their toxic arrogance to fill the room completely undisturbed. He did not interrupt their cruel boasting. He merely nodded his head, playing the role of a neutral, obedient corporate facilitator perfectly. When Chloe finally finished her repulsive, self-congratulatory monologue, Thomas opened the heavy leather portfolio sitting in front of him. He adjusted his glasses and began to explain the parameters of the final estate transfer. He used dense, incredibly complicated legal jargon specifically designed to sound profoundly impressive, while completely masking the catastrophic reality of the documents. He spoke at length about consolidated liability transfers, comprehensive asset reassignment, and unified corporate debt structuring. He was effectively describing a financial suicide pact, but he wrapped it in such beautiful, sophisticated terminology that Chloe and Lucas completely missed the danger. They only heard the words transfer of absolute control and immediate executive authority. Thomas slid a massive stack of pristine, watermarked documents across the wide mahogany table. The crisp white papers settled directly in front of Chloe and Lucas. These were the absolute keys to the ghost ship. These were the lethal documents that would legally and permanently bind their personal names to the millions of dollars in fraudulent toxic debt that Lucas had secretly created. Chloe did not bother to read a single line of the text. She did not ask to consult a financial advisor. She did not ask a single clarifying question about the liability clauses or the massive debt restructuring requirements. She was completely intoxicated by the blinding illusion of absolute power. She eagerly reached across the table and practically snatched the heavy silver pen from Thomas's outstretched hand. Her eyes were burning with a manic, unquenchable, greedy fire. She hovered the tip of the pen directly over the primary signature line, her chest heaving with sheer anticipation. She was mere moments away from sealing her own absolute doom. I sat silently at the far end of the table, my broad, weathered hands resting calmly on the cold mahogany. I watched her perfectly manicured fingers grip the silver barrel of the pen, and I waited for the heavy steel blade of absolute justice to finally fall. The sharp scratch of the silver fountain pen gliding across the thick parchment was the loudest sound in the boardroom. Chloe leaned over the mahogany table, her perfectly styled hair falling over her shoulder as she aggressively signed her name on the final signature line. She pushed the document toward Lucas, tapping the page with a manicured fingernail. Lucas picked up the pen with trembling fingers. He hesitated for a fraction of a second, his eyes darting toward me. I kept my face entirely blank, staring at the polished wood. He swallowed hard, lowered his head, and scribbled his name right next to hers. Chloe dropped the pen onto the table. It clattered against the hard surface, echoing like a final hammer strike. She let out a long, dramatic sigh of relief and leaned back in her plush leather chair. She looked at Thomas with a radiant, victorious smile, expecting the lawyer to congratulate her on her brand-new empire. She was already mentally spending the millions. She was already picking out the color of the upholstery for that Italian yacht. Thomas calmly gathered the signed documents, tapping them against the table to align the edges. He slipped them into a secure leather folder and closed the cover. He did not smile. He did not offer his congratulations. He simply looked across the table at me and gave a single, barely perceptible nod. The time for playing the fragile, broken victim was officially over. I placed my large, calloused hands flat on the cold mahogany table and pushed myself up from my chair. I did not struggle. I did not shake. The pathetic slouch I had maintained for weeks vanished in an instant. I rolled my shoulders back, expanding my chest and drawing myself up to my full height. Decades of wrestling massive steel cables and fighting violent ocean currents had built a physical frame that commanded absolute authority. I was no longer a confused, grieving widower. I was Silas Hawthorne, the undisputed master of the maritime salvage fleet, and I was taking my ship back. Chloe frowned, her perfectly sculpted eyebrows knitting together in sudden confusion. She watched my physical transformation with a look of growing unease. She opened her mouth to ask if I needed assistance, but the words died in her throat the second she met my gaze. The hollow, vacant stare I had been feeding her was gone completely, replaced by a cold, unyielding predator's glare. When I finally spoke, my voice did not waver. It was not the soft, tired whisper of an old man. It was the booming, resonant roar that I used to cut through the howling winds of a Category 4 hurricane. I told her that she had incredibly beautiful handwriting. I told her it was a real shame she never bothered to read the fine print before applying that beautiful signature to a legally binding federal document. Lucas visibly flinched at the sound of my true voice. The remaining color drained from his face, leaving him looking like a terrified ghost. Chloe let out a nervous, dismissive laugh, attempting to regain control of the room. She looked at Thomas and asked him what on earth I was talking about. She demanded to know why I was suddenly acting so aggressive. Thomas remained perfectly silent, leaning back in his chair and allowing me to deliver the killing blow. I walked slowly around the edge of the large table, my heavy boots thudding against the floorboards. I stopped directly behind Lucas, resting my heavy hands on the back of his leather chair. I looked at Chloe and explained the exact nature of the trap she had just eagerly locked herself inside. I told her that she had not just signed over a $40 million maritime empire. I explained that the true assets, the deep water vessels, the commercial dry docks, the waterfront real estate had all been legally and irrevocably transferred into an independent offshore trust days ago. I told her that the Helen Hawthorne Foundation now owned every single valuable piece of iron I had ever built. Chloe stared at me, her mouth opening and closing like a suffocating fish. She shook her head desperately, denying the reality unfolding in front of her. She stammered that she had just signed the papers for the holding company. She insisted that she now controlled the entire fleet. I leaned forward, resting my weight on my son's chair. I told her that she was absolutely correct. She did indeed hold absolute executive control over that specific holding company. But I explained that the company was nothing more than a hollow financial shell. A ghost ship. I told her that the only things left tethered to that corporate entity were the massive predatory loans, the completely toxic private debts, and the millions of dollars in fraudulent liabilities that her cowardly husband had illegally generated to fund her lavish lifestyle. I watched the horrible realization finally strike her eyes. I told her that she had not inherited a fortune. She had just legally assumed absolute personal liability for massive federal bank fraud. She had just signed her own financial death warrant. The silence in the boardroom was absolute. Lucas dropped his head into his hands, letting out a pathetic, suffocating whimper. Chloe shot out of her chair, her face flushing a violently angry red. She screamed that I was lying. She pointed a trembling, manicured finger at me and shrieked that I was a crazy, senile old fool who was making up insane delusions. She looked desperately at her sister Brenda, expecting backup. Brenda, however, was completely frozen, clutching her expensive handbag and staring at Chloe with a mixture of shock and dawning horror. Brenda was arrogant, but she was not stupid. She could sense the incredibly dangerous shift in the atmosphere. Chloe slammed her hands on the table and demanded that Thomas destroy the documents immediately. She screamed that she had been tricked into signing them under false pretenses. Thomas calmly adjusted his glasses and pressed a small silver button recessed into the mahogany table. The massive digital presentation screen mounted on the far wall of the boardroom instantly flickered to life. The room was suddenly filled with the crisp, high-definition footage from the hidden security cameras inside their luxury kitchen. The audio played through the sophisticated boardroom speakers with terrifying, absolute clarity. Every single person in the room heard Chloe outlining her magnificent, malicious plan. They heard her plotting to physically provoke me. They heard her specifically state that she was going to use my legendary temper to have me locked inside a psychiatric ward so they could execute a hostile takeover of the Hawthorne fleet. They heard Lucas completely agree to the betrayal, quietly planning to silence his own father for a life of easy luxury. Brenda let out a loud, dramatic gasp, pressing a hand over her mouth. She stared at the screen, watching her own sister casually plot the destruction of an innocent, grieving man. The snobbery and entitlement completely melted off Brenda's face, replaced by sheer, unadulterated disgust. The video seamlessly transitioned to the footage of the dinner party. The camera angle perfectly captured the formal dining room. The room watched in agonizing silence as Chloe purposefully escalated the tension. They watched her lean over the table and aggressively strike my face. 1, 2, 3. The sharp, stinging sounds of the slaps echoed off the boardroom walls. 4, 5, 6. I watched Chloe's physical reaction to the footage. Her aggressive anger completely evaporated. Her shoulders slumped forward, and she began to hyperventilate, backing away from the table, as if the screen itself were burning her. 7, 8, 9. Lucas was openly weeping now, his tears falling onto the polished mahogany table. 10, 11, 12, 13. The video abruptly cut to black, leaving the boardroom in a heavy, suffocating stillness. I looked at Chloe. The arrogant, conquering queen from 10 minutes ago was completely gone. She was trembling violently, her pristine white dress suddenly looking like a prisoner's uniform. I told her that my memory was absolutely immaculate. I told her that I remembered every single agonizing second of her cruel little game. I explained that I had swallowed my pride and endured her physical abuse specifically to build the impenetrable iron cage she was currently standing in. I told her that the forged medical directive she had attempted to push through Judge Harrison had been intercepted, permanently sealed, and added to the massive mountain of criminal evidence against her. Chloe collapsed back into her chair, covering her face and sobbing hysterically. She begged me to stop. She pleaded with me, saying that she was sorry and that she would give the holding company back. She promised to walk away and never bother me again. I walked around the table and stood directly over her. I looked down at the woman who had tried to steal my freedom and erase my humanity. I told her that apologies were utterly useless to a man who had already pulled the trigger. I told her that the consequences of her greed were no longer in my hands. Right on cue, the heavy frosted glass doors of the boardroom swung open once again. The timing was so perfectly orchestrated it felt cinematic. Agent Caldwell stepped into the room, accompanied by 4 uniformed federal officers. Caldwell wore the same serious, unyielding expression he had during our private meeting. The heavy thud of the officers' tactical boots completely silenced Chloe's hysterical sobbing. Lucas jerked his head up, staring at the federal badges with wide, completely terrified eyes. He instantly realized that his pathetic shortcuts had finally caught up with him. Agent Caldwell walked directly to the head of the table. He did not look at me or Thomas. He focused his cold, observant gaze entirely on my son and my daughter-in-law. He unrolled a thick stack of official legal documents and began to speak in a loud, authoritative voice that commanded the entire room. He formally announced that Lucas Hawthorne and Chloe Hawthorne were both under immediate federal arrest. He listed the charges with a brutal, methodical efficiency: conspiracy to commit wire fraud, massive corporate embezzlement, forging signatures on federally insured maritime loans, aggravated elder abuse, filing fraudulent medical directives. The list of felony charges seemed absolutely endless. Every single word out of the federal agent's mouth added another massive iron block to the chains wrapping around their ankles. 2 federal officers moved swiftly around the table, pulling Lucas forcefully out of his leather chair. They pushed him against the mahogany wood, pulling his arms behind his back and snapping cold, heavy steel handcuffs around his wrists. The sharp metallic click echoed beautifully through the quiet room. Lucas did not fight. He did not scream. He simply hung his head and sobbed like a broken, cowardly child. The other 2 officers approached Chloe. She tried to scramble backward away from the table, but there was absolutely nowhere left to run. They grabbed her arms securely, hauling her up from the chair. She fought wildly, thrashing against their grip and screaming for her sister to help her. Brenda completely ignored her. Brenda quickly gathered her expensive handbag and backed away toward the far corner of the room, desperately trying to distance herself from the radioactive criminal disaster unfolding in front of her. The officers easily overpowered Chloe, snapping the handcuffs tightly onto her wrists over her heavy, expensive gold bracelets. Chloe turned her tear-streaked red face toward me. Her perfectly applied makeup was completely ruined, running down her cheeks in dark, ugly streaks. She looked at me with an expression of pure, absolute terror. She was no longer a wealthy socialite. She was a trapped animal, finally realizing that the predator she thought she was hunting was actually the monster that was going to eat her alive. I walked slowly toward her, the heavy silence of the boardroom broken only by her ragged, hyperventilating breaths. I stopped just inches away from her trembling face. I looked directly into her terrified eyes, and I let the full weight of my decades of hard-earned wisdom pour into my voice. I told her that my late wife Helen always used to say that the ocean gives you exactly what you earn. If you respect the water, it feeds you. If you arrogantly ignore the storm warnings, it pulls you under and crushes your lungs. I told Chloe that she had completely ignored the warnings. I reminded her of the cruel, twisted game she had invented at my dinner table. I reminded her of the exact number of times she had struck the face of a grieving father. I leaned in close, so only she could hear the absolute finality in my tone. I whispered the words slowly, allowing them to sink deep into her bones. 13 slaps, 1 for every single year you are likely going to spend inside a federal prison cell. Chloe let out a long, agonizing wail that sounded entirely inhuman. The federal officers firmly grabbed her shoulders and marched her toward the frosted glass doors. Lucas followed closely behind, head bowed, entirely broken. I stood by the long glass window and watched them being physically dragged out of the magnificent corporate boardroom. The heavy doors clicked shut behind them, sealing their absolute fate. The room returned to a state of profound, perfect silence. The toxic, suffocating arrogance that had filled the air only 20 minutes ago was completely gone. I looked over at Thomas. He was quietly organizing his legal pads, offering me a slow, deeply respectful nod. We had executed the maneuver flawlessly. The ghost ship was launched, the toxic debt was contained, and the predators were successfully locked inside a federal cage. I walked over to the mahogany table and picked up my heavy canvas jacket. My hands were perfectly steady. The agonizing, crushing sorrow of losing the son I thought I knew was finally replaced by a deep, clean, hollow sense of peace. I had protected my legacy. I had protected my hard-working employees. I had honored the memory of the woman I loved more than life itself. The storm was officially over, and the ocean was finally calm. I turned my back on the empty boardroom and began the long, quiet walk back to the harbor. It was time to go home. If this story resonated with you, please hit that like button and subscribe to the channel for more tales of justice being served. And let me know in the comments where you are watching from and what time it is right now. It always brings me a great deal of satisfaction to know how far these stories travel. The weeks that followed the devastating confrontation in Thomas's downtown Boston boardroom were a masterclass in swift and absolute justice. The federal machinery, once finally set into motion, operates with a cold and mechanical efficiency that does not care about your designer clothes or your manufactured social standing. Agent Caldwell and his specialized team systematically dismantled the fraudulent empire my son had attempted to build. The federal indictments dropped upon them like heavy iron anvils plunging into the dark ocean. Lucas and Chloe were formally charged with multiple counts of wire fraud, bank fraud, and felony embezzlement. The aggressive private lenders, those financial sharks who had eagerly extended credit against the hollow holding company we left behind, realized almost instantly that they had been completely outplayed. They swarmed the ghost ship, tearing it apart, looking for capital, only to find nothing but toxic debt and worthless paper. The millions of dollars Lucas had illegally borrowed had already been squandered on non-refundable deposits for Italian yachts, European vacations, and custom jewelry, leaving the angry lenders with absolutely nothing to repossess but the expensive clothes on my son's back. Chloe's absolute worst nightmare came to life with terrifying and highly public speed. Her precious social status, the false sparkling kingdom she had worshipped above all else, evaporated overnight. The exclusive country clubs quietly and permanently revoked their memberships. The wealthy socialite friends she had desperately bragged to at her lavish dinner parties suddenly refused to answer her frantic phone calls. Even her own sister Brenda, who had watched the entire horrifying reality unfold in the boardroom, publicly distanced herself, claiming to everyone in town that she had been completely manipulated and had absolutely no idea about the criminal conspiracy. Chloe and Lucas found themselves entirely isolated, facing decades in a federal penitentiary with absolutely no financial resources to hire high-powered defense attorneys. The stolen wealth they had relied upon to shield them was completely gone, trapped in a legal vacuum of their own arrogant making. They were assigned overworked public defenders who could offer them nothing but plea deals for reduced prison sentences. But the final and most undeniable stroke of consequence arrived when I legally reclaimed the massive suburban estate I had purchased for them 5 years prior. Because the property was fundamentally tied to the clean, legitimate assets I had protected during our intensive corporate restructure, my ownership of the land and the structure was absolute. Thomas executed the eviction notice with clinical and unsympathetic precision. I did not go to the house to watch them leave. I had seen enough of their desperate, tear-stained faces in the boardroom to last me a lifetime. Instead, I sent a team of professional movers and strict legal observers to ensure the property was vacated immediately and without incident. They were given exactly 48 hours to pack whatever basic personal belongings they could fit into a standard rented moving truck before the heavy steel deadbolts were changed and the security systems were completely reprogrammed. I ordered the immediate and total liquidation of the sprawling estate. The perfectly manicured lawns, the massive marble kitchen where Chloe had casually plotted my psychiatric confinement, the grand formal dining room where she had struck my face 13 times while my son stared at his plate. It was all sold to the highest commercial bidder within a matter of weeks. I took every single cent from that massive real estate sale and added it directly to the protected offshore trust. I wanted the very foundation of their arrogance to fund the instruments of their defeat. They had willingly traded a life of guaranteed comfort and unconditional family support for the cold, unyielding reality of federal courtrooms and holding cells. They had locked the cage from the inside exactly as I had predicted they would. With the toxic infection completely and surgically removed from my life, a profound and absolute peace finally settled over my weary soul. The crushing, suffocating weight of betrayal that had paralyzed my chest for long, agonizing months completely washed away, pulled out with the changing tide. I woke up one crisp, freezing morning and drove my battered pickup truck down to the gritty commercial harbor long before the city began to stir. The sun was just beginning to break over the dark, churning waters of the Atlantic, painting the massive sky in brilliant shades of bruised purple and burning gold. I walked down the old wooden planks of Pier 4, listening to the deeply familiar sounds of heavy chains clinking against steel hulls and seagulls crying out in the freezing mist. I stepped onto the rusted, salt-stained deck of my very first salvage vessel. The heavy steel plating felt incredibly solid and grounding beneath my worn boots. I placed my calloused hands on the freezing metal railing and breathed in a massive lungful of the cold, clean ocean air. For the first time since my beautiful Helen had passed away, I felt her true presence right beside me, not as an agonizing memory of profound loss, but as a warm, comforting current of absolute approval. We had built this life from absolute nothing surviving, punishing storms, brutal financial currents, and exhausting physical labor. I had successfully protected our legacy from the very worst kind of human greed, and I knew in my bones that she was incredibly proud of the man I had remained. The Helen Hawthorne Foundation became my new absolute purpose and my greatest ongoing project. I took the massive offshore trust we had established and put that protected fortune directly to work for the people who truly needed a shield. We assembled a highly dedicated team of aggressive, brilliant attorneys, forensic accountants, and compassionate social workers. Our sole uncompromising mission was to provide rapid, overwhelming legal aid to elderly individuals who were facing physical abuse, financial exploitation, or fraudulent medical conservatorship traps. We became the unyielding iron wall for grandmothers and grandfathers who had their bank accounts drained by greedy, manipulative relatives. We became the heavy artillery for seniors who were being silently suffocated by the people they trusted most in the world. Within the very first year of operation, our foundation successfully intercepted and dismantled dozens of malicious legal filings. We rescued elderly men and women from locked psychiatric wards where they had been abandoned. We recovered stolen life savings from manipulative children who thought they could operate in the dark. We forced corrupt medical professionals and sympathetic local judges to face the harsh, unforgiving light of massive federal investigations. Every single time we pulled a vulnerable, terrified person out of a dangerous situation, I felt a deep, resonant echo of my own survival. I was using the incredibly painful lessons I had learned in the absolute darkest moments of my life to ensure that no one else ever had to suffer in complete silence. The veteran salvage master was no longer just pulling broken ships out of the coastal mud. I was actively pulling broken lives back from the brink of absolute destruction. I found myself spending my afternoons walking through the local neighborhoods, meeting with the families we had helped, and listening to their incredible stories of survival. I realized that the greatest storms we face do not always come from the unpredictable ocean. Sometimes the most devastating and violent hurricanes are born right inside our own homes, disguised as the very people we raised, fed, and loved with all our hearts. But I also learned that the human spirit, when truly anchored by truth and a righteous purpose, is entirely unbreakable. The pain of betrayal changes you. It hardens your exterior and sharpens your vision, but it does not have to destroy your capacity for profound goodness. Looking back on the agonizing journey of the past year, I know that the scars I carry from those 13 strikes will remain with me until my final days. But they are no longer marks of shame or humiliation. They are absolute badges of survival. They are the undeniable proof that even when you are cornered, isolated, and entirely written off by the people who should protect you, you still possess the power to forge your own absolute justice. You simply have to be willing to endure the freezing water, trust your deepest instincts, and navigate the wreckage with a completely unyielding heart. Family isn't just blood, it's respect. And dignity is something no one is allowed to slap out of you. If you ever find yourself in the dark, don't scream. Gather your proof, build your strength, and let the truth do the fighting. If my journey resonated with you, if you believe that respect must be earned and evil must face the light, please hit the like button and subscribe to the channel. And before you go, tell me in the comments below, what city are you watching from and what time is it right now? I read every single comment. Until next time, stay strong and protect the ones you love.